Hello and welcome to Tattva Conversations and Explorations. For our first episode on economics, we sat down with Professor Steve Keen. Professor Keen is a distinguished research fellow at UCL. He has previously been Professor of Economics at Kingston University, London, and the University of Western Sydney, Australia. His main research interests are the complex systems approach to macroeconomics and the economics of climate change. He has over 80 referred publications on financial instability, money creation, logical and mathematical flaws in conventional and Marxian economic theory, the role of energy in production, and many other topics. He's ranked 19th in academic influences interest of influential economists. Additionally, he's one of the few economists to anticipate the global financial crisis of 2008, for which he received the Revere Award from the Real World Economics Review. He's the author of The New Economics, a manifesto, Debunking Economics, and Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? We talked about his understanding of what economics is and what its essence might be, his approach to economics, the evolution of human thought as can be seen by the movement of major school of economics. What do people mean when they say money is everything or money is nothing? And a good way to think about money. Meaning of value, difference between harmony and equilibrium, and what economics can teach us about ourselves and the world. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of economics, and its potential to shape our lives and our world. Hello, Professor Keen. Welcome to Tattva.
Good to be here. Thank you.
We'd like to get started by getting to know your understanding of what economics is and what its essence might be.
Oh, it's fundamentally it's the attempt to understand our social system. That's the easiest way to describe it, and because that social system comes with political and economic benefits for individuals within it. It's far more a distorted study than something like physics, where you're trying to understand the external reality of the world in which we live. And 500 years ago, we broke away from a religious obsession with the nature of the solar system, for example, that meant for 1,500 years, we falsely believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. And now science and physics and religion are fundamentally separated, or physics and ideology are fundamentally separated. But economics, unfortunately, because we are literally embedded in the system we're trying to understand, and the system as it stands, whether for long-term or short-term, has enormous benefits for individuals within it, given the power it gives them, that ends up distorting our analysis very, very badly. And that's the unfortunate state of economics. It's an attempt to understand a social system, which we undermine by being parts of the social system ourselves. Well, if you take a look at like the conventional definition of economics that you'll find most textbooks regurgitating was done by Lionel Robbins in the 1930s. And he was actually a non-neoclassical economist. He was more Austrian than he was neoclassical, and an opponent of Keynes. So right in the middle of the Great Depression, when 25% of the workforce was unemployed in America, it wasn't quite that bad in the UK, he defined economics as the science of the allocation of scarce means to unlimited wants. He actually said, and this is quite intriguing, scarce means which have alternative uses between unlimited wants. Now, that was implying there was a shortage of resources. In fact, there was an absence of aggregate demand. There were people who desperately wanted to work who couldn't get a job. So it's rather ironic that definition of economics was promulgated during the Great Depression. But that definition embeds the neoclassical way of thinking. It's all about scarce resources, unlimited wants, and alternative uses for those scarce resources. None of those things are true about capitalism. And the definition also completely omits the fact that the social system has to be embedded in an ecological system. So it treats economics as independent of the ecology, the environment in which we live, which was true enough as in the first approximation when humans were a small part of the biosphere, and where our economic impact was minor because we only used a small amount of energy, which was the same energy available to all the other animals on the planet. Now what we're doing is we're using an enormous amount of energy which is not available to any other animals, and that is distorting the biosphere, and that will feed back on the economy. So unless you have an integrated definition of economics, which starts from the point of view that the economy must exist in a ecological environment. Unless you start from that point, you're going to have a distorted form of economics, and that's what we've done. So my definition of economics starts from embedding us in the ecology and says that the reason we can produce, the reason we have an economy, is that we're exploiting free energy that we find in the environment, that other animals can't exploit that energy. Now, there are no, so far as I'm aware, no lions who are operating coal mines. Okay, so that means that we've brought a fundamentally new factor to the environment, the exploitation of masses and masses of stored solar energy from millions of years ago. And we're dumping that into the environment. And because we're doing it, we're now finding out about the laws of thermodynamics, the inevitability of waste from using energy to do useful work. So that's where my definition starts from. There are very thermodynamic foundations of our capacity to have a social system where the energy levels we consume are far above the energy levels that are available to all the other animals on the planet. I frankly think it's better if it got shut down and we let engineers take over and rebuild it for us. That'd be far better than trying to get economists to do it, who have gone completely up the wrong path in analysing society and continue to embellish that wrong path rather than saying we've got to abandon it and start all over again. So I'd rather get rid of economics completely, frankly. And everything has been written since Adam Smith. There are some insights you can take from some elements of what's been done, but it's appallingly bad. So if you look at how they, for example, the students will be exposed to the circular flow diagram, that's impossible. Okay, you cannot have a circular flow without energy coming in from the outside. That's not acknowledged in any of those in the standard models you'll see in textbooks. You also can't exploit the energy unless you dump waste into the environment. Those are also left out by the mainstream. It's a monetary economy. They pretend that money doesn't matter because they have this false notion about the economy evolving from barter. We know from anthropological research that is not true. So they have they then dismiss the monetary system by saying it's just what we've always done, which is barter, which we've never done. So there's just an enormous number of myths built into the fabric of mainstream economics. But those myths are quite comforting and quite convincing to anybody who falls into them. And therefore, you get this intellectual lock-in, which dominates economics in general and continues perverting it. Everyone starts finding its way out of those delusions, because those delusions are so comforting to economists, they try to drag us back into it again.
Would you say that economics is not generally looked at in this kind of integrated way? And for you, what kind of problems does this unintegrated way of looking pose?
If you look where economics first began, I'd take it back to the physiocrats, but most people start with Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was a reaction to the physiocrats in some ways, because the physiocrats argued that all wealth comes from the land. And Smith, coming from industrializing Scotland, at the time he wrote, Scotland was by far the world's leading nation in developing industrial technology. He couldn't see what the physiocrats saw, and that land was the only source. And the physiocrats also argued that industry, the manufacturing, was sterile. They said that so value was extracted by land-based industry, agriculture fundamentally, and then that's where all wealth comes from. And then manufacturing changed the form of it. It doesn't create any wealth on its own. Now that was a wrong deduction they made in their own thinking about manufacturing, because they didn't realize that the energy that powered manufacturing came from the same source as the energy that powered agriculture. It's just that it had been, it was coal we dug up and that had been in the ground for millions of years. That coal was fundamentally storing solar energy from millions of years ago. Now, if they'd made that realization, they would have seen that manufacturing is not sterile, because just like agriculture supports the incoming sun, manufacturing is based on the stored sun. Okay. So they had an error in their thinking. You can understand where the error came from. Well, what Smith did was say, well, he couldn't comprehend the idea that land was the only source and manufacturing was sterile. So his reaction was to say, well, the wealth comes from labor, and growth in wealth comes from the division of labor. That was his analysis. And in that process, the role of energy got thrown out the window. Okay, energy. The word energy wasn't even invented when Smith was writing, let alone the physiocrats. It was first invented in 1809. That meant that right from the very foundations, with Smith, we'd lost the role of energy in enabling production to take place. We'd lost the physical link with taking natural resources to enable us to build the society we have. But also by saying labor was the only source of value, that ultimately led to Karl Marx. And Marx using those arguments as a reason to overthrow capitalism. So what you had in the 1870s, which is when Marx was publishing Das Kapital and so on, was a reaction by pro-capitalist, pro-libertarian thinkers in favor of capitalism and against socialism. And that meant that what was used to be an underground theory of economics based on the idea of subjective theories of value suddenly became dominant throughout the classical school. So the classical school said value, labor, all value came from labor, and effort was the foundation of value. The amount of work you did is what determined the value of something. To the neoclassical saying it's the subjective satisfaction you get out of something which determines its value. And both labor and capital combine together to produce that output without including any role for energy. So we then had 100 years of that. And of course, that theory, by also discounting the importance of the banking sector and discounting money, completely ignored what caused the Great Depression. So the Great Depression came along as a complete shock to the mainstream. Keynes comes along with an explanation emphasizing the importance of money and uncertainty about the future. But that then ends up with a theory which, to some extent, is challenging to capitalism once more, and also is virtually impossible to integrate into the subjective theory of value that neoclassicals developed. So what you had was a break in economics at that point, where the people who wanted to stick to that value of capitalism being a utility maximizing system, and therefore like a social system which is desirable, preferable to feudalism and preferable to socialism, that became neoclassical economics over time. While there's a bunch of rebels who said, look, you've completely misunderstood Keynes's points. Money does matter. Uncertainty about the future cannot be assumed away. Volatility and destabilizing forces in non-equilibrium are the fundamental states of capitalism. And that led to what's called the post-Keynesian school of economic thought. And the defining feature of post-Keynesian economics compared to any other school of economics is a function upon a focus upon realism. They don't start from some airy-fairy notion of utility maximization and so on. They say we want to look at the empirical nature of the economy and try to understand the empirical dynamics we see from meaningful relationships between components of the economic system. So post-Keynesian work is dominated by a sense of realism, and therefore ends up capturing some of the stuff that was lost by the classical and neoclassical schools. Obviously, the role of energy becomes important. Your relationship with the ecology becomes important too. Uncertainty is also a vital factor. So I think what we now have at the moment is economics dominated, like about 85 to 90% of economists belong to the neoclassical school. A substantial proportion of the fraction that don't would be oriented towards post-Keynesian thinking, but they end up being dominated and excluded within the profession by the mainstream. So it's a very conflicted and very unhappy and discordant discipline.
Would you say that it's the meaning of wealth, the meaning of value, the meaning of money that has been the general direction in which the discipline of economics, and when seen through its lens, human thought has moved?
It's a reasonable capture of it. I mean, the thing with a lot of the human thought, we've ignored things over time. Okay, we ignored the ecology completely, and that's all very well to us to ignore the ecology. The ecology also ignores us. Okay, but ultimately, if we don't have a system, the social system is consistent with a sustained ecology, then our social system will collapse. So I think we're very lately, and only in the last really 30 or 40 years, coming to grips with the importance of integrating economics with ecology. And attempts to do that in the past have been dismissed and trivialized. So economists, and particularly William Nordhaus, undermined the work of the limits to growth. which was the first real attempt to try to build an integrated mathematical model of the relationship of the economy to ecology. George Rogan's work on the role of thermodynamics and economics, that was also ignored. And have you had people like Herman Daly who've been pushing forever that we have to make economics consistent with what we know about the ecology. All those things have been ignored. Now they're catching up with us. So human thought has ignored some important things, but those important things also ignore us, and now they're dominating the nature of our economy, and they should also dominate how we think about the economy.
What would be that one thing that you would hope our future generations would thank us, their ancestors at that point, for not doing?
I mean, my worry is that we have not done those things. We're about to strike major ecological crises. The next 20 years, I think, are going to be dominated by a climate changing so radically that we can no longer maintain the advanced civilizations we now take for granted. So I really do think we're on the cusp of a dark age, okay, destruction of human civilization. And what comes out on the other side of that 100 years from now, I'm quite worried that it could be a society that blames engineers and science and technology for the what they'll look back on as an apocalypse that we experience as a species, and possibly go into an anti-technological, anti-advanced science framework and try to ban science. That's one of my great fears. I think that's what I think we'll end up doing. So the important thing would be realized is not the science and the engineering that was at fault. It was the scale that we executed that science and engineering to, ignoring the ecological constraints with which we face. And economists should have been the people who are warning about the dangers of doing that. But instead, they've encouraged us to rush headlong into massive overexploitation of the resources of the planet. And therefore, I think we're going to see our societies collapse. And quite possibly, economics won't get the blame for that, because it'll be the engineering that's obviously in people's faces as to why things went wrong, rather than the economics. So that's my great fear. The positive I can see is that if we realize that it's the economics that led us into this catastrophe, and therefore we have to drastically change our economics and restrain our consumption on the planet and drastically reduce the pressure we put on the planet over time. If we actually do that, then we might come out with a sophisticated understanding of economics as part of the ecology and limited by the ecology. But frankly, I don't think we will. I think we're going to go for the catastrophic route instead. And what comes out the other side may well be like the religions of the Dark Ages after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And if we're lucky enough to even have that.
I feel that economists find it difficult to define money without getting technical. So I thought I'll try to know your thoughts on some of the things that people I have known over the years say about money. Say, when someone says, money is everything.
Actually, that's rather similar to a quote from Karl Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, where he says, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. In other words, the objective of life in a capitalist economy is to accumulate as much money as possible. And that's what drives the dominant social class in capitalism. And we can see that in the incredible inequality that we see, where we have people whose personal worth is measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, whereas the vast majority of the population is lucky to measure its savings in terms of hundreds of dollars. So that is a reasonable foundation, a reasonable argument about what capitalism is about.
When someone says money is nothing.
Normally, they're saying there are a bunch of neoclassical economists who don't understand the monetary system. I think there's enormous ignorance about it. I mean, they gave the Nobel Prize to Ben Bernanke recently for a theory of money, which was contradicted by the Bank of England and the Bundesbank in the last decade. So it shows the extent to which economists want to continue promoting a set of myths about the economy that they like when they have absolutely no foundation in reality. So normally somebody says money doesn't matter. If somebody says you just ignore the monetary system and you can model the economy without it, that is garbage. And that is why we've had so many financial crises in the last 40 years. The 87 crisis, the 2001 downturn, the 2007 crisis, all these things are caused by issues that mainstream economists ignore. And fundamentally, that's the monetary system, because they ignore the role of private debt.
Is there a way of looking that falls somewhere in between, which is a better way of looking at money than saying it's either everything or nothing?
Well, I mean, you can have a philosophical argument saying that life shouldn't be about accumulating wealth. That's more of a Buddhist philosophy or a aesthetic philosophy, and that's probably a better way to live than to be obsessed with money. So there are various ways that can actually manifest itself. But my point is, if you don't understand the social system, you're likely to destroy it when you try to manage it. And that's the point that I'm working on. We have to understand it fully. And economics is actually preventing us from doing that rather than enabling us.
How would you define value? Does your understanding of value differ as an economist and as a teacher, parent, partner, etc.?
Well, value definitely for me when I'm being a partner or an uncle. I actually have no kids, but I've got lots of nieces and nephews. When I'm being that, I value human relationships and the positive aspects of human culture, the empathy, the respect for others, getting your self realization out of how you treat others and how others treat you. I think that's the positive side of our species. We are fundamentally, we are not a bunch of loners. We are not a lot of tigers, who don't relate to each other except when they want to reproduce. That's not humans. We live in social systems. We prefer to relate very deeply to about 150 people, which is about as many as we can actually keep in our heads. That's called the Dunbar number. And then we get our sense of who we are out of the affirmation we get back from that group of 150. That's the positive side of being human. So that's when I think about values, and that's my philosophical values. How do I improve that positive side of humanity, and how do I make that more respectful of the rest of the planet, which is anything but respectful right now? When I work in terms of economics, in terms of value, I see it as basically being energy. What gives us monetary value, what gives us the capacity to create the technology that's enabling you and me to chat from India to Amsterdam right now, that is exploiting free energy and the incredible knowledge of the physical world that we've developed through science and engineering. And that value fundamentally lies on exploiting free energy. And the reason we're so wealthy these days, comparatively to our ancestors in the 19th century, is the sheer amount of energy we exploit per head. So a human worker working in a factory can put in about 100 watts over about 8 hours before they'll collapse, exhausted. Okay. Back in my home here, I'm probably absorbing 4,000 watts at the moment and don't even think about it. And Buckminster Fuller put it very, very well. He said that we used to rely upon human slavery and animal slavery for our sustenance back in the previous century. He said, now we rely upon energy slaves. We don't even see them. We, open up the back of our car, put a hose in that pumps oil into that thing and turn the engine. And we don't realize that's like being pushed by 500 slaves. So my focus in terms of value, in terms of economics, comes down fundamentally to energy.
Could you share your understanding of the concept of synthesis, antithesis, and thesis?
Well, as it happens, the version of the dialectic you've just given me is not Karl Marx's or Hegel's. It comes from a guy called Fichte. Okay. It's something, for some bizarre reason, that is what people thought was Marx, mainly because it's so hard to pronounce, they thought it had to be Marx. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Yeah. In fact, Marx's concept, what he called a unity, foreground, background, and tension. That's his real thing. Okay, so that analysis, which I took from reading Marx, and I've since found from reading philosophers who know what Marx actually said, that's Marx's method. That is how I think about value. That's how I put the whole system together. So dialectical thought, in that sense, is the foundation of the way that I think about the economy. And I've definitely benefited from knowing that from economics. But that is, first of all, Marx is ignored by most economists. They don't know. They haven't never read Marx. They write him without reading him. And secondly, if they do, they take that Fichtean approach to his dialectic, which is wrong. And most of them don't even do that. They stick with the labor theory of value. So what I got out of all of this is an incredible capacity for humans to get things wrong, and then to form cults that are based on getting things wrong. I don't know if you're a fan of Monty Python, but if you know the Monty Python Life of Brian. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and Brian at one stage is trying to escape from the Romans, so he goes and stands in the square and starts behaving like a preacher, and then ends up accidentally getting a following that chases him into the country, into the hillsides. One of which was based on the thong that he dropped, and somebody else I've forgotten what they grabbed, and there was a pro thong and an anti thong faction by the time they got to the jungle, to the desert, and that capacity for humans to latch onto a belief system and then build their whole worlds around that belief system and reinforce it with their own social group and attack others that have different beliefs. That's one of the horrific things about humans. And I think the only way we're going to have a potential future is if we come together and see I think humans should regard their main role as being preserving and extending life. That's what we should all agree on. Okay, because we're the only intelligent species on the planet that can manipulate the physical world to create new systems. And we should be doing that in a way that promotes life rather than destroying it. But in fact, we've been doing it in a way that destroys life.
In these trinities that you just gave us, one by Fichte, namely thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and the other by Marx, that is foreground, background, and tension, would you say that the words tension and unity mean the same thing?
No. The basic concept that Marx had, and this is coming from Hegel's philosophy, was that any entity, whether that's a human or a commodity or anything else, is embedded in a social system. The social system will focus upon one aspect of that unity, which becomes the foreground. But the unity itself can't exist without the background elements, which the society basically ignores. And that causes a tension between the foreground and the background aspects of that unity. And that tension can both change the unity over time and change society. So it's a very dynamic vision of the foundations of economics. That's one of the many things I like about it. And I can apply it to explaining where profit comes from, to the role of money in a capitalist economy, to our links with the ecology. It's a very powerful way of thinking, but it's something you won't find in any normal text on Marx. So that's why I'll be writing my manifesto, the book called The New Economics, a Manifesto, is a short version of what I intend writing, with a long version that will include that philosophical foundation.
Could you please elaborate what equilibrium means to you, and how does it differ from the way we comprehend the word harmony?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that equilibrium is a desirable state is nonsense. This is one of the weird things about neoclassical thought. If you go back to the 19th century and work out why did neoclassical economists use the concept of equilibrium, partly was because they saw capitalism balancing the marginal cost of something against the marginal utility, and therefore there was an equilibrium concept tied up in that. But it also, they just knew that if you read the original writers like Jevons and Walras and Mengo and Marshall, they all thought that equilibrium thinking was just a shortcut to doing proper dynamic analysis. They said we don't have the tools to do non-equilibrium thinking properly, but we can do equilibrium thinking properly. So let's do equilibrium first, and then we'll do non-equilibrium work later, because non-equilibrium is obviously the broader case than just equilibrium. They failed to do that. They've never developed a realistic dynamics. And in fact, what has happened is equilibrium has gone from being a shorthand and a limited form of analysis before we can do the sophisticated stuff. It's become almost like a mantra, like a characterization of an ideal system. An ideal system is in equilibrium. If you were in equilibrium, you'd be dead. Okay? Not only will you be dead, you'd be frozen to absolute zero. So that is equilibrium. The reason you're moving is you're a non-equilibrium system. You're taking in energy from the outside, you're expelling waste. The difference between the energy you take in and the energy you just dispose of is why you can have your interactions with the rest of the world. So the real world is non-equilibrium. And that's the exciting, that's what we should be aiming for. It's where we are. There are some forms of non-equilibrium that are dangerous, such as financial instability. But fundamentally, non-equilibrium gives us the dynamics and the change and the passion of human society. And Schumpeter was excellent on that. Schumpeter has an article called The Instability of Capitalism. And rather than seeing it as a criticism, he said that's where the creative force of capitalism comes from. So we've turned equilibrium into a form of a religion, when it was just basically meant as a stopgap form of analysis in the 19th century before mathematicians and engineers could develop dynamic tools that economists could use. And instead, scientists and engineers have done that. That's one reason I built my Minsky software, to make that stuff more available to economists as well. But scientists and engineers have built the means to analyze non-equilibrium systems, and economists are still obsessed with equilibrium. And that's, I think, an enormous reason why their work is so bad and so wrong. Harmony. Well, harmony, we live in a harmonious relationship with others. So we change in ways which are compatible with the ways that others are changing. It doesn't mean we're in equilibrium. Equilibrium would be you stayed as a 17-year-old all your life. There's some appeal about that, but
no movement at all. No
movement, no change, no development. Now, if you imagine, being a child of 12 and dying with the maturity and experience and knowledge of a child of 12, that's equilibrium, but it's not harmony. Now, harmony, you meet somebody, you go through life, you change, you develop, you enrich each other's life, and you enrich in ways which is compatible. That's what we mean by harmony. Where economists have, because that's something that humans actually do seem to search for. They do desire harmony in their relationship. They desire harmony in their physical situation as well. It's similar to equilibrium, but far, far different. So economists have effectively hijacked the desire we have for harmony and made it an argument in favor of equilibrium. But like equilibrium would mean the phone you use now is the same phone you used in 1910. Okay, that's not what we mean by that would not be a desirable life. Okay,
I got it.
And it isn't possible to analyze the long run change and development of our system as if we're in equilibrium all the time. So it is a nonsensical way of thinking about change through time.
Is there room for creativity in economics?
Yeah, it's right, but that's not the way economists themselves behave. They want to enforce their way of thinking. And this is something where I'll blame the neoclassicals now only because they're the dominant group. Marxists in the Soviet Union behaved the same way. Okay, they didn't want to hear any alternative ways of thinking. So that's partially this I think is a human phenomenon. When we have a belief about the world, the belief we have about the world dominates our perception of the world. So Thomas Kuhn's work on the structure of scientific revolutions explained that scientists believe their theory. They believe their paradigm. They're trying to prove their paradigm all the time. So we're wedded to what we believe is our vision of the social system. And that can be very destructive because you want that creativity to break away from it. But it's very, very hard. And that's what I'm finding in economics, that what you call normal science in economics is neoclassical equilibrium thinking. And I'm trying to bring about a revolution to say that's just the wrong way to think. We need to have a dynamic, non-equilibrium, monetary, ecological vision of economics. And I face enormous resistance to that from economists. They're very disparaging of my work. They're insulting towards me. They ignore the concepts that I bring up. And so we get locked into a false way of thinking. And that's been humanity all the way through. We've always done this, whether we're talking economics or science or religions like, Jonestown and people poisoning themselves as part of a cult. This is just part of human nature. And we have to be aware of it and aware of its limitations. And so far, we certainly haven't achieved that.
What would you say economics has been able to tell you about who we are and what the world is about?
Mainstream economics, nothing. There's nothing worth learning in mainstream economics. So I'm being quite didactic there. The sooner we get rid of it, the better. Mainstream economics, I think, is like the phlogiston theory of combustion. It's neat, plausible, and completely wrong. Or Ptolemaic astronomy. Okay, you can build a model of the solar system using Ptolemaic astronomy. You can tell where the planet's going to be in a couple of 100 years' time, and you're completely wrong about the structure of the solar system at the same time. That's the state that I see mainstream economics in as being. There are some elements of insight in the non-mainstream elements. So Schumpeter's work on uncertainty and non-equilibrium, Marx on the philosophy, the work of the physiocrats on energy, what post-Keynesians have done. There are some decent insights we can take out of all that. But the ultimate one we have to take out is that we have to have an economy which is sustainable on the ecological foundation we have, and we are far from that. And in fact, we're destroying the ecology, and that will then destroy the economy. So that's the main thing I think we need to take out of it. That, and also we should never put economics as the primary objective, the physical economy as the primary objective. It should be, as I said, human society and life. We should be using the fact that we can exploit free energy sources to enhance the livability of this planet for all life forms on it. And that's not what we're doing at all. We're actually destroying that. So I think if economics ultimately gets to the stage where it understands itself, then we'd say, well, our role is to use the capacity that we have to exploit free energy that no other animal has, okay? The dolphins may be more intelligent than us, but they don't have opposable thumbs. They'll never build anything, okay? Now we know in, let's say, roughly about 300 million years, we know that the sun will expand enough and get hot enough that the Earth will no longer be in the habitable zone. Earth will become uninhabitable. And the Earth is the only planet which we know life exists. So with that knowledge, which no other species has, we should be saying, what do we do to maintain life, even though we know that what has been the cradle of life will ultimately be its graveyard unless we leave it? Yeah, I mean, economics, I think, is going to be the force that destroys human civilization, frankly, okay? Neoclassical economics will be responsible for the collapse of human civilization. And we then have to rebuild out of that. If we ever get a sensible economics, then it will see the economy as subservient to the maintenance of life, and then attempt to understand the fact that we can exploit the energy we find in the universe with the technology we've built by the incredible knowledge we've accumulated in the last quarter millennium. That will then make economics a servant to the maintenance of life and the extension of life throughout the universe. At the moment, it's probably the main barrier we face to the maintenance and extension of life is our own economic theories. Well, fundamentally, what it's taught me about human nature is that the humans are capable of believing things which are fundamentally false and reinforcing that belief until such time as because the falsity of the system ultimately confronts an aspect of reality that destroys that belief system. So that's unfortunately what economics has taught me. And we've seen it in previous ideologies, Nazism being one obvious example there. I'm not equating economists to Nazism, but a self-reinforcing but destructive belief system. And that's been the nature of humanity. You know, we believe it. We used to believe in the Roman Empire, or believe in the gods of a Teutonic group trying to fight the Romans, etc., etc. The fact that we are driven by our beliefs, and the only way to have a sustainable humanity for the future, those beliefs are based in realism, and they're not yet. So that's why I'm so strong about getting a realistic economics, a form of realism for understanding both the system we're in and why it's going to break down. And then ultimately we have to have our belief system being based fundamentally around science. And in terms of science itself, economics pretends to be a science. But even when you look at sciences, you find scientists are driven by their beliefs. They believe their paradigm is what they believe, and they try to extend the paradigm. There's something about the nature of science that means that false beliefs ultimately get driven away. And we have to reproduce that as broadly as we can for our own human society to have any chance for the future. About our world, I've learned a lot by reading outside the mainstream. What I've learned about the world has come from reading economists that other economists tell you not to read. The Marx, the Schumpeter, the Keynes, the Minsky, the Goodwins, they're the people who have taught me, and I've learned an enormous amount from them. But what I find is that therefore makes me a rejected minority within economics.
Could you define what you mean by abundance?
In fact, I'd say abundance was the source of economics, not scarcity. If you look at if you look at Ricardo, I've just been reading Ricardo again recently, and Ricardo literally defines economics as being about things which are not scarce. Economics is about the stuff which we can reproduce without limit, as long as we're willing to throw labor at producing it. So economics evolved when we try to understand the manufacturing system we have, where rather than having things as scarce, we have them in abundance, and then we have to get rid of them and sell them. So that is a much more realistic foundation. Scarcity, Mercado relates scarcity to things which, like a Picasso painting, is scarce. There's only one Picasso and he's dead. Okay, so the prices of Picassos are not going to be based on the cost of production of a Picasso. It's the scarcity of a Picasso that sets its value. And Ricardo says that's what economics is not about. It's not about the scarce stuff. It's about the stuff we can reproduce without limit. Okay, if it was just the scarce stuff that mattered, then by definition, we wouldn't have a production system. Okay? Production is about producing stuff en masse. So it's understanding a mass production system. That's where economics evolved. And you can see that in terms of the discipline of economics really only began around the 1700s when we started to have, from our point of view, very primitive, but from their point of view, extremely advanced technology exploiting things like peat, wind power, water power, and so on. And then that enabled you to have production in factories rather than craft systems, and then manufacturing and marketing of major products. That became where economics came from. So again, the focus on scarcity is another wrong attitude of neoclassical economics. And if you go back, if you look at like hunter-gatherer societies, they didn't perceive scarcity unless there was a drought that killed the game, that they couldn't get away from the drought fast enough. Okay, so our initial societies, if you ask a hunter-gatherer whether they're experiencing scarcity, no. And there's actually quite fascinating interviews with Kalahari Bushmen and other still hunter-gatherer societies today. Well, I saw one of them where one of the group is saying, "What's a door for? What do you need a door for?" Okay, what's the function of a door? In other words, they're quite happy, sleeping in camps in the open. If you have a tent, it's just to keep the rain out. A door, what's a door for? So it wasn't scarcity that gave rise to economics. It was abundance from a manufacturing system. You would have seen the movie Avatar, the very first movie, Avatar. Okay, clearly fictional, but the idea is you had this, advanced civilization turns up and tries to bribe them, and at one point the pain in the asshole of the boss who runs the whole system there talks about trying to persuade the native, what they called the Navi, saying, look, we offered them education, health, growth, and they weren't interested. They've got everything they want. Now, of course, yes, there are things like, for example, health is a good example. You'll have, in a pre-industrial society, you won't have penicillin. So there are some elements where, yes, we could offer things they don't have. But fundamentally, those societies within their own constraints, they don't see themselves as suffering from scarcity, anything but. There's an abundance of game out there. There's plenty of plants to go and pick. The population is constrained to what's feasible given the resources, and that's partly our problem. We expanded so rapidly because we were so much more successful hunters and gatherers than any other animal, and that's what led to us reaching both the production system, but let's get rid of scarcity is a key concept of economics. It's a false foundation for thinking about the economy. I seriously expect devastating ecological crises, certainly in the next, say, 5 to 25 years. Okay, before we're 2050, that's going on the limits to growth and all the research I've seen from climate scientists and so on. And so in that world, the trauma that will cause to the survivors, the only hope that I have is the long term. That trauma says we must put life first and foremost. We must put humans in general subservient to life. We are not dominant on life. Life will only exist if we regard ourselves as part of it and not the most important part. So if we go through all that and we come up with that mentality that we have to preserve and extend life, then we'll have a chance as a species and a chance as a civilization. But I think to get there, we're going to go through hell.
You've been a teacher for over 35 years, and you must have taught students from different parts of the world. Would you be able to talk about the different perspectives that students hold, depending on the countries they come from?
Economics tends to steamroll people from different perceptions. So that's one of the problems. If they come to an economics degree, they're likely to get twisted to fit within an economic way of thinking about the world, a neoclassical way of thinking about the world. But I certainly see different cultures having different foci on the pardon me, the degree of integration and the degree of sharing that should appear in a society. So the Americans, in general, are very self-oriented. I actually had a PhD student write to me saying he hadn't filled out a particular rule because he believed in American exceptionalism, and therefore, the whole question is whether this rule should apply to me because I'm an American. I rapidly declined his application to do a PhD with me. That's the last sort of person I wanted to work with. Equally, you'll find people coming from particularly a Buddhist background who are much more inclined to see the role of the humans as part of an ecological system. So different belief systems help. But economics tends to steamroll the lot and have people thinking about us as a non-empathic creature that only cares about its own individual utility maximization, that can produce without generating waste, which is a total farce, and which is therefore believes we should exploit the resources of the planet and grow as rapidly as possible, which will lead us into a calamity. So different philosophies, a Buddhist philosophy in particular, philosophy come out of more of animist societies. If you have a society where an animist religion is still moderately dominant, then they will have more of a capacity to understand the ecological inputs we have. But yeah, generally, I'm afraid economics tends to rule everything, and people end up being all materialistic, which is going to be why we cease being able to be materialistic at some time in the near future.
What would you say you're most thankful to economics for?
Well, I suppose because if I hadn't done an economics degree, I'd be a lawyer, and I'd be bored shitless being a lawyer. I mean, I've certainly had an interesting life, and in some ways, the fact that economics is so bad meant that I've got a degree of fame for the work that I've done that may have been hard to accumulate if I actually became a physicist, which was actually my first interest at school. I don't know that I could ever have made the contribution to physics that I've made to economics, because physics is actually well-grounded, and it's harder to do something useful there than it is in economics, where most of it is garbage, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better.
Thank you for coming on Tattvadeep and sharing your insights and time with us, Professor Keane. We wish you the best.
Thank you.
My conversation with Professor Keane helped me understand how economics impacts the way we live, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of how we look at energy and its role in defining the future of the world. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.